but you're also dealing with a lot of different organizations that are stakeholders with how the decisions are made, and it's not just a city that's making a decision, and not just the Department of Transportation, for instance, is involved. And so how do you coordinate the priorities and have them be in alignment with the fundamental priorities of, if it's building a bridge that is moving traffic across the bridge, well, integrating the additional priorities of saying, well, in addition to vehicles, we want to think about how do we move people across this bridge. And then in addition to that, we want to think about what are the materials that are going into the bridge. Do we really need the bridge? I mean, there's a whole series of questions that go into that. I think one of the stories that that I learned down in my job working at the city is the importance of integrating capital planning with operations, and how do you think about a plan is a plan and will always remain just being a plan until you get the buy-in and understanding of what that plan means to someone that has to operate and maintain whatever it is that's on the plan, whatever it is that's the blueprint for. And a variety of the savings that we've realized in the city that have enabled me to go from a program coordinator of a sustainability office to hiring staff and becoming a real office were making that connection, changing operations in a way that were in alignment with the intention that the building was built, as an example. And something that the mayor did was, we piloted doing a different style bridge, that incorporated planters and incorporated better, wider sidewalks and a barrier between the road and the sidewalk so that the snow plows didn't, slop the snow onto the people in the winter. And after we did that, the mayor said, all right, well, this is the bridge. So we piloted a new approach, and then upon success of that new approach, made that a policy. And I think that that's the success that our office has had, is working across all the departments, the necessary departments, and then trying something new and saying, all right, we're going to try this something new, and if it works, then we want you guys to take it on. If it doesn't work, you can blame us. So, which happens sometimes. So.
Good. Well, that's great. And I don't want to sort of ignore the building side of things, since you mentioned that, Roger. I wanted to ask you, Roger, and hopefully get Andrew and Lindsay to chime in on this as well, but sort of thinking about how do we make green building, this concept and bring it into reality, really something that gains critical mass and becomes a driving force for change within cities. And then thinking about that since we have you from the private sector point of view, we have two of our guests from the public side, how do we align those interests so that they're a driving force for change, so that we start thinking together how we're going to embed what we call ecological design principles into all the buildings that we see in the future, all the places we go to in the city, if that's our goal.
Right. In terms of green buildings, I think there's been quite a lot of cities around the country that have created some wonderful initiatives. Coming from New York City, they recently passed something known as Local Law 86, which requires any buildings that receive a certain level of public funding to be LEED Silver certified and also perform 25% better than local energy code. And I think it's really beneficial to just kind of force certain projects to do it, because the more and more projects there are out there, there's case studies, it creates a demand for new products, more efficient equipment, so-called greener materials, and eventually the cost of those things drives down, and then the economic argument to incorporate those kind of automatically, by default, kind of, you get kind of this strong force. In terms of public and private, one thing that I think is important that hasn't been mentioned yet is also education, and using that as kind of a way to sync those two together. And this is on all levels, but I'm also even thinking in particular primary school education and just where people start out. And traditionally urban environments are not known for the greatest public school systems, and that's an issue because it leads to this exodus of people out to the suburbs, which inherently, it's not high density development, so you don't get all the benefits from building dense.
Right.
Right. The entire entirety of New York City, they generate as many carbon emissions as a country of Norway. But on a per capita basis, it's about 60% less than the national average because people are able to live in small spaces, but there is also a vibrancy. So people are fine not living in such huge places because you can go out on the street, have a nice meal, go to a concert at Lincoln Center, and so on. So education is important. I think that's kind of something to bridge public and private. And then also I think having mandatory programs is important. If you make it an option, people won't do it. So.
Right. Lindsay and Andrew, do you want to talk about what the city of Cleveland, city of Pittsburgh are doing on the incentive side to bring along the private market to sort of help with that sustainability agenda?
As far as actual policies like mandates, like you were suggesting, we haven't had a lot of success with having one of those passed yet. We're kind of on the brink of it right now. We do have an incentive within the city. It's a density bonus incentive for developments that achieve LEED Silver, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. In case you're not, LEED is the U.S. Green Building Council's green building certification. So it's sort of an easy way of knowing that it's actually legitimately a green building and knowing what type of savings you're getting from that. We're working right now on potentially a requirement for either new buildings or renovations that are publicly funded or in TIF zones that are either above a certain threshold price or a certain threshold size by square foot. So fingers crossed we'll be rolling something like that out soon. We've traditionally, several years ago we were always a leader in green buildings, and we're still, I think we're maybe 5th in the city, or excuse me, in the nation as far as the amount of green buildings you have. But much of that was done by the private sector, by a very good nonprofit, the Pittsburgh Green Building Alliance, and by leaders like PNC Bank and some others who really adopted these principles very early on. So.
Well, in Cleveland, in 2006, Mayor Jackson asked me to think about how do we require green building standards in the city. And it was interesting because my response to him was that we can't. The state adopted a policy that prohibits municipalities from adopting building code that's higher than Ohio Basic Building Code, which was something that was pushed through to try to have consistency across all municipalities on building codes. So then we looked at the impetus for this was a reauthorization of tax abatement. And so the mayor took an approach of saying, well, maybe we can say that if you are going to get tax abatement, it's got to be LEED certified. And we looked at the standards of LEED certified, Enterprise Green Community Standard, and Energy Star certification as sort of looking at those national standards as recognized. What we ended up not being able to get that passed to council. What we did get passed was an Energy Star requirement that actually comes due. If you want tax abatement, 100% tax abatement, starting in 2010, which isn't very far away now, you have to build the Energy Star standards. In addition to that, when we didn't get that passed, the mayor said, well, let's look at all of our other incentives and make sure that our other incentives that we're doing that we're providing for developers to build residential construction in the community, that we're promoting and encouraging green building standards. So we started off with carrots and providing, if you met LEED certification, and LEED Silver certification, you got additional dollars from Housing Trust Fund dollars within the Community Development Department. And then slowly that's turned into, across all of our programs within community development, green building standards. It was released earlier this year. It's called the Cleveland Green Standard. So we do provide incentives now. The challenge that council had, I'm not trying to pin it all on council, the challenge is that we were really promoting development, period, in the community. And to hear cities like New York and Chicago and Portland and San Francisco and Seattle, these are all strong market cities. And so to add layers of green building standards on, it's the right thing to do, but it's also easy to do within that development community where you have high margins on the projects. And it was much harder when we've already thrown everything in the kitchen sink just to get people to build here, to then say, oh, by the way, we're going to do, you have to build a LEED. And I'm sure that Pittsburgh had that conflict with the development community.